Here we are, Manchester Futurists, live on YouTube.
I hate to interrupt, but I think you're muted, Georgia.
Oh, do you know,
Hey,
this happens every time. I've been doing this here now.
Welcome.
Right. And I've just told someone else to mute themselves as well. Okay, let's start again. So hello, welcome to another Manchester Futurist live event on YouTube. I'm Georgia and I'm your host for this evening. This week, we're delighted to be joined by Solana Larsen from Mozilla. Solana is the editor of the Health of the Internet report, which was released in January. Her work questions what it means for the internet to be healthy, focusing on 5 key areas of interest: decentralization, privacy and security, openness, web literacy, and digital inclusion. All areas I'm sure we're concerned about too, especially because last year and this year, we're spending a lot more time online. So just before we dive into some tough questions, we've got a bit of admin to do. We have some rules in our code of conduct, which you can see on the next slide. If my lovely assistant Hannah, here we are. Essentially, the main thing is please be nice to each other and give our moderators in the comments section an easy job to do, because they'll be going through your questions and making sure that they get asked. So you can get in touch in social media. Please do follow us on Twitter and Facebook for updates on our next event. And we've now left Meetup and are focusing on our efforts on Twitter and Facebook. So give us lots of likes and follows to keep up with our activities on these platforms. If you'd like to ask a question today, please do so in the chat, or you can message us on either Twitter or Facebook and we'll make sure that it gets asked. And you can also catch up with our videos on YouTube on this channel. We realise it's a pretty random link at the moment, but once we've got 500 subscribers, we can change it to our name, which is a really good reason to hit the subscribe button below. So over to you, Solana.
Thank you, Georgia, and thank you, Manchester Futurists, for the invitation to come and have a chat with you. I'm Solana. I'm based in Berlin, in Germany. I've been with the Mozilla Foundation for 4 years. Mozilla is the maker of Firefox. That's probably what Mozilla is most known for, but it's also a nonprofit that does or works to make the internet better in a lot of different ways. And not just the internet, but the web. And these days also thinking about data and artificial intelligence and all the ways that the internet serves or doesn't serve the best interests of humanity, really. And that's where this framework of internet health comes from, because it is kind of strange, if you're not used to the term, to think of the internet as something that can be healthy or unhealthy. It's not a living creature, but at the same time, it's not just cables and wires and computers. The way that we think about it is as an ecosystem that can be balanced, that adapts to change, that adapts to human behavior, and thinking about it as an ecosystem, as something that's malleable, something that we can affect, is part of, I think, how we try and think about just our role and responsibility as humans in making it better. And health is also something that you need to work at. There is no such thing as a perfectly healthy condition in an ecosystem or in a living organism. It's it's something you need to work at, and something that changes over time, what it means for something to be healthy. So when we started the Internet Health Report, it was with this idea that we could begin to measure across many different indicators whether the internet was in fact getting healthier or less healthy on a whole bunch of different metrics. And what we realized was it was a lot harder to measure the things that people really want to know about the internet. I mean, we asked people and we had surveys and we did different things, and we realized, well, people really want to know how much hate speech is there online, for instance, or how much disinformation is there. And though we have a lot of proxies for talking about that and measuring that, once you're thinking about the internet in the global context across all languages and across all different topics and issues, those are things that are really difficult to count. So how can you begin to track things over time and have conversations about what needs to happen with technology, with policy, with activism, in order to make the internet healthier? And so we have the Internet Health Report. And I'm going to share my screen now and show you the 2020 edition of the Health Report, which was published just a few weeks ago. And every year we change the design a little bit. It's quite creative. It's called a report, but it's really more of an experience. I like to think of it. These bubbles you see are actually links to articles. Every year we have 3 spotlight topics, the ones in the colored boxes. And this year we've also added a feature. We asked 100 people to share a healthy and an unhealthy moment for the internet from 2020. And you can see their faces here. Let me just expand the screen. And here you can see the many different stories. The green are the healthy, the red are the unhealthy, the pink. And you can explore them across issues, across regions. And the point of this is to show, as we think about over time, what is happening, that there is both good and bad. I think we get so overwhelmed with negative news about the internet that it's important to also look at the wins and the achievements and the things that are moving in a good direction, because things do indeed move in both directions at the same time. And when we think about, bringing all this together, it's part of taking a moment to stop and think, what do we actually want the internet to be? How can we take what we learn about what has happened and what is happening and be optimistic enough to imagine a better future for the internet, to imagine that we can cause change, because change happens all the time. And many of these things, when we talk about, let's say, social media or the web or, many of these things didn't exist even just a few years ago. And so when we think about them as new things and we remember how they're created and are able to track that over time, I think it also begins to feel like something less ephemeral, something that is actually more tangible and more possible to change in different ways than we tend to give it credit for. So this year's health report, it has a year in review, look back on 2020, what are the big trends that we've seen that give us some hints about what could be happening in the future, what are key opportunities for the internet health movement, if there were such a thing, which there is in some ways. Our 3 spotlight topics pick up on the zeitgeist around some issues that are emerging right now and are really important. Racial justice, of course, unless you've been under a rock, racial justice was a topic this year of reckoning in so many different contexts, but also for technology and the internet. This article here is, I think, a really great primer on what does racial justice mean in the context of the internet? How is the internet used to oppress in different ways that we don't recognize? Explaining what it means to say that technology isn't colorblind. I think it offers some really interesting language and a historical perspective that shows that people like communities, technical and otherwise, have been pointing out the biases of data and algorithms for a long time, not just now, but for a long time, and have been met with backlash and denials. And so how do we move past that point and start to think about what it means for technology to serve actually equity, and to serve different communities, and not simply be designed to sort of meet the needs of this imagined default user that fits some kind of mainstream image of, let's say, an American technology developer who's a male in the United States, for instance. But it's a really good piece. And for all of these stories, in the same way that we've included the voices of 100 people at the bottom here, it's not an academic type report, but a lot of spoken quotes and conversations with people and examples of things that people are doing. Same in the second story on labor rights, unlock data power. We look at the way, not least in times of COVID, the way that data and the gig economy sort of merging together to change how labor is controlled, or how the commodification of labor has really increased in the gig economy, how the data that's collected about people and transactions is used to control and organize labor, and then what it would mean for that data to be in the hands of workers themselves. That if you could think of ways for workers to own that data and use it to prove when they've been wronged, or to hold companies accountable, what are the different opportunities that are opening up for that right now? And there's some really interesting examples of groups that are experimenting with different ways of collecting data across different platforms and different devices and combining it, and also different legal forms, legal methods or legal frameworks that they use in order to, and sometimes to co-own the data in order to be using it collectively, for instance, in unions, or in other for other collective purposes. And the final story is around transparency in social media, and particularly how do you force transparency in the areas that the companies are not forthcoming on, when it comes to sharing information. If we don't know from the companies themselves how algorithms for group recommendations work, or for flagging false news or disinformation, if we don't know those things and can't rely on what the platforms are saying, how can we create that kind of transparency ourselves? What kind of collaborative research tools exist? What kind of browsers or browser plugins are different organizations creating in order to effectively hold companies accountable? How can we be better watchdogs, really, of these gigantic platforms? So those are some of the issues that we looked at so far. Like I said, every year there's a different set of spotlight stories, and I really just, if you're interested in these issues and thinking about them practically, these are relatively short articles, but I think really deep and full of links to research and other reports. And so I definitely read the report and engage with the ideas and talk to other people about them. We have at Mozilla an annual festival that's called MozFest. I'm just showing the website for it here. It starts on March 8. It's a pay what you can sort of ticket. Everybody's welcome. Thousands of people participate every year, and this year it's completely online. In the past, it was hosted in the UK. It was meant to have been in Amsterdam this year, but it's now 100% virtual. So many different talks around the topics in the Internet Health Report, and so many more, and a great place to meet other people who enjoy talking about these issues and thinking about how we can make a bit better internet in the future and in the near future, because a lot of these things are really urgent to solve. when we think about what it means to be, for the internet to be healthier, I mentioned before that these 100 people, we asked them to share something healthy and something unhealthy, but we also asked each of them to share a short statement on what can be done to make the internet healthier. And there are two people who some of you in Manchester might know who also participated this year. Ahmed Ratzek, who is, I believe, monitoring the comments on the YouTube Live tonight. He shared this comment here, and two stories, a healthy and an unhealthy. Ian, who is here on the call, also participated this year and shared a healthy and an unhealthy as well. I wonder, Ian, just so it's not just me talking, but what did you think about the question of the healthy and the unhealthy? A lot of people found it difficult to think of something positive to say.
Yeah, so this is Ian. Yeah, it's quite a difficult one because you can easily jump to some of the headlines and go, well, this doesn't seem very healthy. This doesn't seem very positive. There were some positive stuff, but I wanted to look a little bit deeper because I'm aware of the Internet Health Report and the legacy that it has. So I tried to look a little bit deeper and think about my statement would kind of attach to something which is a little bit longer running than a news story that was the thing of the month, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was also interesting to see across the different issues what type of things people picked up on. We did a lot in terms of finding people from different parts of the world and with different areas of interest and expertise, also looking at the arts, also looking at academia and coders, and just that mix of different people who are approaching the problem from different angles, I think is part of what you really need to make a difference in terms of something as large and all encompassing as the internet. And that's something that we celebrate a lot at Mozilla, and that we try and foster that kind of not just cross-cultural communication, but also like cross-sector communication. Yeah, I think that's what we tried to do with the feature, and it would be great if people who are watching this would want to browse through and send us feedback. Would be great. We have one last thing on this website, which is the facts and figures. And it's basically a slideshow of a whole bunch of issues that I thought I would run through with some of you, and then we could pause at a couple of them and chat a bit about them. There's about 35 slides. So I guess the challenge would be how many can I make it through in like 10, 12 minutes? But they're quite beautiful. So I hope you'll enjoy it. In the past, we did these things more as entire articles, and I think this wasn't a year to overwhelm people with a lot of text. So this visual approach I really like. The first one is a basic point, is that this year of all years, since with the pandemic, with more people working from home, so many schools closed, this was the year that internet really can make a difference between life or death in some cases. I mean, unless you have internet in a lot of places, you can't even sign up for a vaccine. You can't go to work, you can't be in school. So it's devastating for those who don't have it, and just the greatest gift to those who do. Who has power over the internet? I think this is one that, we know that the big tech companies, the 7 big companies we always talk about, we know that they're big, but this chart actually shows the biggest companies in the whole world, not just the biggest tech companies. And you can see that the seven blue ones, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Tencent, and Alibaba, which are the 2 big Chinese companies, they are up there. Only bigger than them is only the Saudi National Oil Company, Saudi Aramco. So that's like the size and the scale that we're talking about. And I think sometimes that comes-
Solana,
Mhm.
a question for you about this one. Sorry, I'm gonna make sure you get through the slides, but do you think that there's, I mean, from the last few internet health reports, do you foresee that that maybe in the next 2 years that the Saudi will be overtaken by?
Yes, it has actually, well, I don't know, who am I? I'm not like a fortune teller, but Apple did actually overtake Saudi Aramco at some point last year in 2020. And these pandemic times that have been so hard for a lot of different sectors have been absolutely great for the bottom line of most of these companies. Not all of them, but for most of them, they've really soared. Amazon has soared and has just hired hundreds of thousands of more people in very short amount of time. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to track over time and to think about how is it that they make money and what is the business. What are the main money makers for these companies, which is sometimes not quite clear. Like even the fact that Facebook makes most of its money on advertising, or that Google makes most of its money on advertising, isn't always clear to people. Here's another one, even bigger, even smaller tech depends on big tech, and this is a chart that shows something about the cloud computing. So you know that apps need cloud computing, and like the apps on your phone. When you watch Netflix or when we're using Zoom, a lot of that computing, that hidden computer power happens in the cloud, and the cloud computing is controlled also by big tech. So you see Amazon is the big orange slice, Microsoft is big, Alibaba is big, Google and Tencent. And so even when we're talking about small tech developments and alternatives to big tech, oftentimes all roads still lead back to big tech because they also control so much of what happens behind the scenes. Same with social media. This is a list of the most used ones around the world. 4 of them worldwide are owned by Facebook. WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, of course. The scale of misinformation is just huge. How does it spread? There have been so many different studies that came out in the past year and a lot of great media coverage. A point that we often make is that you can't just solve these problems by deleting content. You have to look at the structure of how social media works, the business model also. But there's links under every slide to more information where you can read more about it. This is something around content recommendations. This one is about data processes that, again, are invisible. But when we think about, a lot of people talk about like Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. AI uses a lot of energy as well. And people don't think about how these machine learning, these complex processes for natural language processing, like emit carbon. And this study got quoted a lot this year, and it's about how a single deep learning model can emit as much carbon as the manufacture and lifetime emission of 5 cars. So it's not, how can we make these things more tangible and think about the internet as being like sustainable?
Solana, on that one, that's really interesting, and I'm glad that you're kind of highlighting that. I was wondering, is there more that we could be doing to highlight that? Because yeah, it's easy. I've seen this all the time. People saying, well, cryptocurrency, this is obviously a massive drain on the environmental impact, but never really think about that the suggestions that they're getting from like Netflix or iPlayer could also have a massive impact, and they're not really thinking about that. So I was wondering if there's more that could be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so confusing because the devices themselves, like the phones that we have or the computers that we have, don't use much power. Like even if we watch Netflix for hours on an iPad, it doesn't use much power in your home, but it uses tons of power somewhere else. Probably more than your refrigerator. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there are ways for these different companies to begin to operate in greener ways, and many of them do. I think that's part of it. It's not only, I think, for the consumer to think about this. It's also, you know, we need rules, and we need to have just a different concept of how, you know, what these technologies should be allowed to exploit really from our planet and from humanity. There's a whole track on sustainable internet at MozFest that is really interesting. And this is a really, I think, a very exciting and emerging field, because just like environmental justice in other aspects, like not internet aspects, really intersects with a lot of other issues, also with racial justice, also with you know, poverty and other problems in the world. It's a similar thing with these issues, with almost all the internet health issues. Is yeah, there's just a lot of really interesting intersections once you start thinking about the root causes for problems and how things work. Nearly half of the world is still offline. That might come surprising to some people in an age of connectivity. And that's especially women, of course. Sometimes when internet connectivity in a country goes up, it doesn't automatically mean that it goes up at the same rate for men or women. Usually it can even decrease for women, depending on where you are in the world. You really need policies to get women online as well. Some great studies exist on this. Hate speech is a huge problem. There are a lot of surveys and studies in different parts of the world. This one was made by Plan International and is one of the bigger global studies that we've ever seen. And yeah, this is very fascinating. I think I maybe didn't emphasize enough before, but this is a compilation of research. So this isn't original research that we've done. This is stuff that we've compiled, that we've shared with the people who've done the research, invited them to give us feedback and on the images and the text that we use. And so it is more of a collaborative process of figuring out what goes into this slideshow together. When the internet isn't affordable, people stay offline. This is a chart that shows the different prices of connectivity around the world. And you can just see what is considered to be affordable is this black line, the 2% of gross monthly income, and just how expensive it is, regionally speaking, to go online. So you not only have, in a lot of the red colored regions, you not only have like the slowest and most unreliable internet, you also have the most expensive internet, hugely expensive.
I find this one really powerful as well, Solana, because you know, especially in the Western worlds, we kind of think of it as being, you know, especially with 4G and 5G coming and stuff like that, we think it's just there, and we don't really think about it as actually not affordable. I know people do complain a lot about, especially with the kids at home, about getting the internet access and pay-as-you-go data.
In many parts of the world, you don't have unlimited data plans. And so these are like mobile internet prices. Broadband internet might be beyond reach, or, you know, not affordable at all, but it's common in a lot of places to have multiple SIM cards that you change between all the time, because some rates are more affordable at night, some in the daytime. And so you have different deals and packages that you're constantly switching between in order to get the most internet out of what you have. And so watching a video is going to set you back actual money that you take out of your pocket. And so it's not something that people just do. And the same with like image heavy websites, which are bad for the environment, you know, which have like a higher CO2 expenditure. They're also more expensive for people. Just part of what I was talking about, that, you know, if you did make the web greener, for instance, that's something that also affects the bottom line of people who are browsing the internet, you know, counting every penny.
Do you think that's also connected to the the people that are not online, partly because of the costs of it. It's kind of a complete barrier to being online.
Yeah, it's a huge barrier. And bringing down the cost of internet isn't just something like, it's not just that the companies set the prices. It's the kind of thing that you need infrastructure investments, and you need national policies for, and you need interventions again at several different levels. You need to do things to improve competition between the different internet service providers and telecom companies. It's something that you can really actually change with intent, and that has been changed in many parts of the world. And so it's a shame. There's much to be done still, and much that is being done. And there is, thankfully, at least with COVID, there's been, I think, renewed momentum around this connectivity issue. The digital divides have become something that people are eager to talk about again. And this digital divide issue, the slide I showed before shows like different regions, and as you would expect, you have Africa, you have different parts of Asia where there's less connectivity, but in all parts of the world, also in the United States, where this data comes from, this is a chart that shows how having broadband access at home decreases dramatically along with income. So if you have a low income, you're less likely to have internet at home. And that is something I think a lot of people have opened their eyes for with homeschooling and people trying to access the internet outside libraries or in different public venues. You have that all over the world, also in the so-called rich countries. This chart is about quality of internet access. So one thing is just getting access to the web, the internet, but it's also what are you able to do with it? Because if you only have a phone, or let's hope at least it's a smartphone, like can you write essays on it? Can you apply for jobs on it? And this chart shows how many days you would need to work to even own a smartphone. And in Sierra Leone is like the shock number. You would need to work for 194 days in order to afford a phone. And so I like that this highlights, just what a big barrier it is, not just the cost, but also having the device to be able to do anything meaningful. And in times of COVID, having a smartphone is also the difference between having a COVID contact tracing app or not, which, some of these apps are problematic. Some of them are quite well designed. What we see on this chart is a list of countries, and then the blue dots are when their national apps were launched in the App Store, and then each of the blue dots is when the apps were updated. And so you can see along the bottom, March, April, May, as the global pandemic was spreading, how many countries introduced national apps of different kinds, and how much they were updated right there in the beginning, and then how it kind of tapers off a bit towards the end of 2020. Some really interesting research done by MIT Technology Review. Yeah, this is more like a call for caution that there's limited evidence of the effectiveness. There's a lot of privacy and accessibility concerns. More research and understanding is needed. Along with these kind of things, when I said some of these apps are problematic, in some parts of the world, it has been a sort of slippery slope, not just these apps, but other things like movement control or temperature controls or workplace surveillance. There's so much more surveillance now as a result of the pandemic, and so much that just got rushed through and pushed through, and new businesses, and it's going to have a lasting effect on the internet and technology. Internet access, again, question. There are a lot of internet shutdowns around the world. I think many people don't recognize how many there are. this is data from 2019, where there was at least one internet shutdown in progress every single day across 33 different countries. This is data from Access Now.
I'll say that would shock me, Solana. That was quite to realize that every single day there is a shutdown.
That's right.
It kind of was staggering.
Yeah, and some of them last for years, and others last just a couple of hours. And sometimes they're regional, and sometimes they're national. Sometimes it's only a handful of apps, or it's the whole thing. Usually, is not good. It's not good for people. There are all kinds of justifications for why it happens, but in a lot of places, it can be as little a justification as that there are national high school exams and they don't want students to cheat, and then they'll shut down the internet for everybody. But often what happens when internet gets shut down, let's say during conflicts or protests or that kind of thing, is that a lot of things, human rights abuses, are able to happen in the dark of the shutdown, or people aren't able to contact emergency services or reach out to their families or work. Yeah, so it's really something that is important to make sure that the internet is resilient and it's open and it's not used as a tool of oppression and control, because then it's not healthy internet. And again, this slide here is based on some research that a Mozilla fellow named Petra Molnar did on refugee communities in Europe, in particular, this particular study, and how technology is often tested on really vulnerable populations and then later rolled out and used on the rest of us in different ways. Very interesting. More on tech surveillance, a fantastic study by EFF, the Atlas of Surveillance, where they crowdsourced information from different police and other law enforcement services across the United States, and they tracked what kind of technology they're using and where and what kind of contracts. And it's not secret information, it's just different when you put it all together. So it's really the power of data to tell stories, and this one is very impressive. Data privacy regulations are being enforced more. People talk a lot about the GDPR in Europe being great. There's a great study also from Access Now on the fines that have been levied, the different challenges people have faced to actually hold companies accountable. There's a long way to go, really. Facial recognition has been banned in some parts of the world, and sometimes it's individual cities, but there is some recognition of the fact that these kinds of technologies, although they're often introduced in order to protect people, can also be used to oppress and survey, and are problematic and create false positives and yeah. Antitrust is on the rise. Activism among staff in tech companies is on the rise. Some great studies and research. Gig workers have been mobilizing for their rights. There's a great organization called Fair Work that has been doing really mission-driven research to try and figure out what are different conditions that gig platforms are offering. How can gig workers unite and do things to improve condition? Gender diversity at tech companies is not doing well. I can show you this one again. This one shows the difference between 2014 and 2019 for each of the companies. So the blue are the men and the red are the women for Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. And the first bar is 2014, and the second is 2019. So in 5 years, you can see how little has changed in terms of gender diversity at these companies. despite all kinds of statements, saying that they support diversity. Similar on questions of race and ethnicity. These are not diverse companies by any means, even though they serve the entire world. And yeah, this lack of diversity in technology, it does taint our perspective, not just on AI, but all kinds of all kinds of things that we see on the internet. Ethical guidelines on AI, there's a lot of them. This is an interesting study that looked at a lot of different ethical AI guidelines and looked at what they had in common and what the issue was with them. This one, what we chose to highlight here is how few of them actually have like binding agreements. So they're like voluntary commitments or recommendations, but there's a lot of talk about ethical AI, but not so much firm commitment or action. A lot to be done there. European regulation could be a game changer in a similar way that GDPR is, new laws, policies that are coming up around this. There are a lot of opportunities to really make big inroads, new ways to change how we do things and how we approach these opportunities with technology. Cities can do a lot to change the rules for how technology is purchased, create more transparency in all steps of the process. New data models like the ones I was talking about in the labor sector are emerging as alternatives to big tech. New initiatives where people are taking control of data, figuring out how they can use data to serve the interests of communities rather than, data just being something that is used to market stuff to us or to make big, powerful companies even more powerful. A lot of interesting work going on in this field. And so we made it through the slides and we're still just within the limit of the time. And then the spotlights are part of what can be done. Like what can be done was really the big question of the year. And so we have like some unhealthy, we have some healthy, and then the question is, what do we do to make things better in the future?
Thank you, Solana. That was amazing. I'm surprised you got through it. There's so much there, and it's well worth kind of digging through them, in your own time. Georgia wanted to ask the first question.
Yeah, so we've got a question from someone on YouTube, and they ask, what kind of skills do we as average internet users need to develop to contribute to a healthier web? And I guess that sort of fits into sort of the wider question of how do you begin to create healthier systems that work for everyone, considering the scale and the complexity of the internet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the question is also always how much of the responsibility do you put on the individual to actually do those things? Because it's true. I mean, you can sign a petition and you can, you can try to avoid Google, but that's not going to really be possible for most people. I don't know. It's a mix between individual choices, like what do you share on social media? What do you share about your kids on social media? Or how do you protect your privacy or the privacy of people that you care about? And then there are these really bigger questions, which are actually political. Who do you vote for? And what does a healthy internet mean in the context of where you live? And so I think it's less about technological skills, maybe, than if you want to make a difference, it would be to figure out who's active on these topics where you live, and who do you want to engage with on this? Because there are so many different issues, like hate speech. There are lots of groups that do support for women or campaign against things like online image abuse or online bullying. You know, there are so many different ways to get involved in making different corners of the internet healthier, or even coding things that are better. Yeah, I don't know. So there's some high-tech ways to do stuff and some low-tech ways to do things.
Similar to, sorry, Ian, I was just going to say it's almost similar to the sort of topic of climate change, where people, you know, it's the top 0.1% of people, you know, who actually make, you know, causing the biggest changes, and yet that responsibility is put on, you know, ordinary people as how much can we actually do. But yeah, it's sort of I've seen similarities between sort of those narratives, and you know, it's definitely a big political question, this about sort of the democracy of the internet and who is responsible for it.
And the things go hand in hand. So just because, you know, taking a shorter shower or using a different browser, you know, that's not going to solve the whole problem. But I do think that it is part of becoming more conscious and aware.
I noticed the activism among staff. Is that new this year?
That has been something that's been brewing for a couple of years. I think we mentioned it last year, but it really increased this year. It's one of the later slides. There have been a lot of protests around COVID and labor rights among some staff. And so it depends how you count tech staff. But there are, like, in your mind, you might have people sitting at computers, but then you also have, for instance, the content moderators, or you have the people who do other kinds of contract labor. And then you do have there's like the big scandals there were around Me Too in big tech companies. You had some big scandals around ICE, you know, the immigration enforcement authorities in the United States and what technology companies were supplying to them. You had protests around, I think this is the one, right? The tech companies who have contracts with big oil, and staff who are protesting against doing like advanced AI work for oil extraction purposes. So there is a lot of involvement from staff trying to figure out what are the limits, how can you help steer a company away from a direction that you feel is unethical. It doesn't mean that it's like the majority of staff in all these companies, but you have significant increase in staff raising their voices and influencing decisions, I think. This study, I definitely encourage anybody interested in this topic to look at the references at the bottom. Collective Action in Tech, this one study here. It's full of links to data and other charts, and it's really interesting.
We have another question from YouTube. So with regards to the clash emerging between Facebook and Australia in the past few days, do you think in the long and short term this is likely to lead to a healthier or less healthy internet?
I only honestly saw a headline about the Australia story last week, so I'm not entirely sure. That was about online advertising and news and that kind of thing, right? Yeah. I don't know, that topic is one that comes and goes. It's hard to say. I'm not sure what the alternative proposed is. I mean but that's the problem with, you know, Google has more than a 90% market share worldwide in terms of search. It's huge, and so that's the problem, is their enormous market power and how you rely on them for reach if you are a media publication. I don't know.
I guess we can't really talk about the health of the internet without talking about Facebook, and especially now that Facebook own 4 out of the top 5 used platforms. and you know, what's happened to the web since that sort of shift? And do you think we might be asking the wrong questions here about sort of how we create a healthier internet when they are essentially in charge of so much? That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of what needs to happen, of course, is to hold these companies accountable, but we also need to think about ways to limit their power and to enable alternatives to even have a chance to succeed. What happens these days is if somebody is successful, then Facebook buys them, which is how they ended up with 4 of the biggest ones instead of just one of the biggest ones. More, I'm exaggerating a little, but you know, that is definitely an issue, that the big platforms buy up anything that is successful. But you know, it's also just, you can't even count these things on, like, how do you measure success in these terms? You know, is it just who can make the most money, who can get the most users to use the platform or enjoy the platform, or what is actually, if we think about social media being healthy, what is the purpose that we want it to serve, and how can we think about it from that angle? And then maybe the purpose isn't for it to be like the biggest that serves the entire world. Maybe it is for it to be something entirely different. You know, that there are many, or that they work in different ways, or but we get so stuck talking about the internet in terms of just these big companies, you know, the Facebook and the Google and everything. And someday they might not be so powerful.
Yeah, I think that goes back to Ian's point earlier about the stories that, you know, people were giving you about sort of their healthy examples of the internet and unhealthy, you know, throughout. It's like we could go with these, you know, these headline stories and things, but actually you need to look a bit deeper as well, because there's so much more to the internet than, you know, the major things that everyone uses.
Yeah.
On a related note, I'm wondering, because I know a big part of one of the things in the Internet Health Report is around decentralization. Do you, obviously you have to plan for next year or this year. I'm wondering what difference that Twitter's decentralization plans might factor in the Internet Health Report in 2021. Trying to get a scoop ahead of time.
I doubt that it will, as long as Twitter's core purpose continues to be to make money. It's hard to say, you know, because again, even for all these big platforms, good and bad happens. A lot of them take steps in good directions to do different things, and those are worth celebrating, because it does make a difference. But you know, there's a lot of issues there around hate speech and moderation and transparency, and so does a company that has worked the way that it has so far give me, you know, hope that they will be the ones who invent something better? Not so much.
I mean, yeah. I mean, the difficult part is that we're doing it ourselves. We're talking about these big platforms again, and you know, through the Internet Health Report, you definitely try and think a little bit wider and look a bit deeper, especially around some of the other platforms like we probably are not aware of, like Tencent, for example. I know a lot of people are probably not aware of Tencent and some of the other Chinese kind of big platforms. I was wondering if there was a conscious effort to kind of not highlight them, but to say, look, you know, the Amazons, you know, the Facebooks, but there are these other big players in this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel it's actually this year in particular has been the Chinese companies are a bit of a blind spot. Like, we talk about them and we acknowledge that they're there, but when it comes to the research that we've been able to uncover, things are very separate, even though we haven't had access to as much of it. And like we tried to look at things like tech diversity, tech sector diversity in the past, and thought, well, maybe they would have numbers about men and women, but it's very difficult to come by a lot of information. Last year, I think in the health report, we had a little bit more, and we looked at how do the different big companies make money, and then we looked at the Chinese companies as well, which I think was interesting because they have similar business models to the companies, the 7 big companies that we talk about in our end of the world. And yeah, we also looked at initiatives to counter censorship online in China. So yeah, we talk about how splintered the internet is in some regards, and that a lot of that has gotten quite more heated in the past year or so. Obviously, like with the stories that made big headlines around Trump and the Chinese internet companies and that kind of thing, but it's happening quietly in other contexts as well, and in other parts of the world. So yeah, there's more about that in the year in review, but it's definitely interesting.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time now, and there's time for one last question. It's such a fascinating topic to unpick, and we could be here for hours. So I'm sure that lots of people will be looking at this report afterwards and, you know, coming up with lots more things that they'd have liked to have asked. But what are sort of your thoughts for 2021 and your projections, just to sort of close it with a very big question to ask you about what you see sort of happening next and, you know, looking forward?
I guess I would point you to the year in review, which is actually more of a forward-looking thing. So there's been a reckoning with big tech. You know, I think the big tech companies have never been criticized so much before from all sides and in the media, and people are really aware of being entirely dependent on them, and appreciative on one hand, but also extremely critical and worried and concerned about a lot of things. So I think things that are happening around antitrust, things that are happening around privacy laws, data protection in different parts of the world, so-called tech backlash, there's going to be more of that. And I think that's a cause for optimism, some cautious optimism. Again, what we just talked about now, the splintered but resilient, there's a lot happening in terms of, internet shutdowns, apps being, like, just basically the internet being less global in a lot of contexts, and sometimes born of real, actual concern or problems or national interests, and then other times, you know, control and oppression, and like, so figuring out some of those big questions, I think is something that a lot of people are going to be devoting attention to in the next year or so. And then there's the movements and the uprisings. I mean, not just around tech, we talked about some of them, but also racial justice or protests in Hong Kong or Poland or India or Chile. There have been so many examples this year of really significant mass protests. There's always some protest going on somewhere in the world, I'm sure, but no, really, I think this was a year where there was a lot of people power on some of these big topics. And I think it could have a positive effect on the internet, in the sense that more and more of these social movements rely on the internet, not just for, you know, getting heard or taking pictures at protests or that kind of thing, but the issues intersect. Internet health is important for feminism. Internet health is important for racial justice. It's important for pretty much any social cause that I can think of. It's just really important for education, for equality, for you know, making the world better. And so I think there's going to be more people power, more people power on the internet health issues. Yeah.
And like I said, that's a good optimistic note to end on. So thank you so much for talking to us today, Solana. It was really great to hear from you. And hopefully next year when the report's published, we'll be talking about a more democratic, diverse and altogether healthier online world. And hopefully you'll be able to join us in Manchester to talk us through your findings in person. That'd be nice. We can look forward to that. So for those of you watching, our next Futurist YouTube Live will be taking place on March the 18th at 8 o'clock on this channel. So please do follow us on Twitter and Facebook to hear our news and look out for our blog too. So thank you very much for listening today at home, watching. I keep forgetting it's also watching, but yeah, thank you again.